All right, welcome back to another episode of the Conditioning Standard podcast. Today is another solo podcast, but I do have a few people lined up for the next couple of weeks. Got a fortnightly BK conditioning podcast coming up as well, where we'll dive into a bit of bodybuilding news. We'll also run over, a bit of informative stuff around more contest prep specific information. Things like, most people probably went through their peak weeks if they're listening. I spoke to a few people like the lovely Nerida, who brought an amazing package for figure division in the women's bodybuilding categories. And I've spoken to a few other people at the most recent competitions as well. But what are we going to cover today? Well, I'm going to run over my current training, do a little bit of an audio diary log, and go over a couple things that are coming up on my end that I'm pretty excited about, and how maybe, other people can get involved more in natural bodybuilding, because for me, that is where I'm trying to give back as much as I can, because it's what I love. And I wish that more people did it, because it would make this community just even that little bit better. And not to say that it isn't awesome already, but it can always be better, right? So, training. I made some changes of recent. I increased my total sets on my arm work. Why did I do that? Well, they feel very recovered already in terms of soreness. It's not really the main thing that I'm looking at or listening to, but they feel very good on that front. I also just feel like there's more to give. I'm also mainly being led by training performance, which is going well. But, as long as I'm not going backwards and I'm progressing at a frequent enough rate, then I'm pretty happy. And that sort of poses a good question to anyone that's, a bodybuilder, is how often should you be progressing your logbook? And there's really, it's a very nuanced answer. There's not really a one right or wrong. Every 3 weeks, if you don't progress if you don't progress this movement, you're doing too much. And I think a lot of more advanced lifters can attest to this, that progression becomes less as you get more tissue on your frame, especially as a natural athlete, and even as a, enhanced athlete for that matter. But then also, we do still need to see progress. But I think really the main thing that I've really improved upon over the last 6 months, and just continuing to improve upon, is my execution and having that standardized. Because if that changes, are you really getting an extra rep, or is it more the fact that you're performing that last portion of the set differently because it's getting tough and you're not able to maintain a standardized execution, which for a lot of people is a challenge at the start. Being able to fight through the discomfort of maybe some fatigue that's accumulating in the muscle. A lot of times we feel this as a burning sensation. No, it's not lactic acid. We are more likely experiencing just fatigue as a buildup of pH levels in the cell of the muscle are increasing or low. Don't quote me on whether they're increasing or lowering, but there's a change in the pH level in the cell. I should really know this. I've got a couple of weeks until my exam, so I should be all over this. But there's a change in pH level. Lactate is potentially accumulating in the cell because it can't be expelled quick enough, but it's not because it's lactic acid, right? Like, lactate is actually a really important form of energy in the body. Like, we're able to recycle that in the liver, convert it into glucose again via gluconeogenesis, which is just the creation of glucose. And then that can then be used down the line for other energy processes in the body. But my execution has improved significantly. Other than just watching back my videos, all the movements feel better. I know it doesn't account for everything, but I think it says something. It can be a good indicator that you're doing something right, okay? So increased arm volume. It's 4 sets of biceps and triceps before my leg sessions. I'm doing a preacher curl variation, a overhead extension on the cables, a cable curl in an incline bench with my arms just hanging behind my torso, and then we have this really nice machine tricep extension where your upper arms roughly perpendicular to your torso. It's probably a touch down, and you're just extending out like a push down type of movement. But it's a beautiful old strive piece. And if you don't know, I'm a massive machine head. Not that I get the opportunity or like exploring gyms all the time, because I really do like just training at the same place and Groundhog Day, as you might put it. But I do really have a keen eye for nice machines, and I really, really appreciate them. Partly because I get exposed to them at my gym. I do feel that it can make a gym really cool, but then it can also make training so enjoyable. But even simple movements like a overhead cable tricep extension, I absolutely love that movement, and you can do that pretty much at any gym. So that's been going good. Done that for 3 or 4 rotations now, and I'll be able to really start to assess performance over the next couple of weeks, see whether we're seeing a trend upwards. And in terms of other things I've changed with training, well, I dropped my infamous dumbbell back extensions. It's not really my infamous movement, but I really picked up how to do that from Daniel Chappelle and Brandon Kempzer, who initially put me onto it, and then the addition of the band around the upper back, which is sort of a must, I think. But really, I've been doing that for at least 1.5 years. And I thought, hey, let's see if I can handle doing a hinge every 3 days. So I'm currently running a barbell Romanian deadlift and then a belt squat Romanian deadlift. They're two, it's the same movement, just on a different piece of equipment, but 2 very different movements. The amount of extra stability you're able to get because you're doing it on a belt squat, it sort of opens the door to getting a little bit more total range. And I'm really liking it. It's tearing up my hamstrings. They are sore right up until the next leg session. But I'd also say there's a bit of a novelty aspect to that too, which expect to see drop off in the next 1 to 2 sessions. So there's that. Other than that, everything else is the same. I haven't changed any movements. We've got a beautiful Prime plate-loaded press at my gym, and I've gone back to the neutral grip, and it's been absolutely phenomenal. I can't believe I, went away from that. I had good rationale towards why I went away from it, but I'm just so much more stable, and for whatever reason, it is really hitting the last 2 times I've used it, so I'm going to continue doing that. So other than that, everything else pretty much the same. Nutrition to stay the same at about 3,700 calories, 240 protein. It's about 485 carbs, 74 fats. And that has pretty much seen my weight been pretty stable at 94, I will admit. The last 5 days haven't been as consistent as I'd like, but that is going to change just with the fact that I'm in a more consistent routine this week. And I just need to make sure that I hit my output 10,000 steps a day, and that keeps my weight nice and steady. And look, this week I'm actually going down to Melbourne for the WNBF national show, which is going to be awesome. I have the privilege and honor of judging at that show, which I'm really excited about, and sort of a way that I am wanting to give back to natural bodybuilding and try and get involved and promote the sport as much as I can. And it's really cool to go from being a backseat judge to now being able to go, hey, like I can actually have an impact here, and not be a backseat judge anymore, be a judge a front seat. So it's pretty cool, pretty excited to do that. But I'm really liking what WNBF are doing, and I'd like to see more people support, and I'd like to see this federation really flourish in Australia. And it's not to talk down on other federations. I just do have a bit of a bias towards their definition of natural, and also the way you got a routine in there. And I also like the ability you have to take this internationally as well to sort of the next level, the elite level, where all the top pros are in the natural bodybuilding scene. So that's really my influence there. I still really like ICN. Every federation has room to improve, but ICN is quite a predominant Australian federation. They do have their worlds, which I haven't had a huge amount of exposure to, but I do know that it looks like an awesome show. So I definitely not talk down any other federations. And I think I've maybe said this before, but one regret I had from my first season was not doing an NBA show because they look awesome. But moving on to other things up and coming, got the end of uni happening. So I'm pretty happy with how I've been managing that stress-wise for the last couple of weeks. But there was a period of time where I was just overstressing, and on 3 occasions I got to a certain day in the week and was like, damn, I've got this thing due next week and I'm just not going to be, it's going to get done, but it's going to be a push. And then I figure out it's actually a week later. So I'm organized in advance, but it's always a good feeling when I wouldn't say too organized, because thinking something is a week earlier than what it actually is sort of indicates you're maybe not organized, bud. But anyway, other updates. We are actually not far away from our NBS camp in Bali, which is going to be a really cool experience and actually can sort of segue into another topic of discussion. But essentially what we're running is, it's about a week, maybe even, I think it's 7 days. We have Steve Hall from Revive Stronger. We have Dirk Emmerich, who was the WMBF Pro Lightweight Bodybuilding Champion in 2023. We have Brandon Kempter. We have Dr. Rachel Kempter. Then have myself and Nathan Wallace, one of the OGs in natural bodybuilding in Australia, all coming together to take, I believe we have 20 to 22 people coming on, a week long of training, education with seminars on most days. And then we're going to have some fun too, enjoying the Bali experience. And on top of that, we also got some special guests, Winnie and Kevin from Malaysia. They have done some recent study, I believe. I'm not sure about Winnie, but I know that Kevin has just done his master's and did some research on lengthened partial training. So it'd be cool to hear some of his hands-on experience in that domain. But what I'd sort of like this to segue into is the value of in-person learning and how it's sort of a lost form ever since COVID. Just having conversations with a few other people who've been around the shop for a long time. And, it used to be quite a popular thing. You get some bigger names coming out from the US. So yes, maybe that's had an impact, but I still think that in-person learning is super underrated, and this doesn't undermine the value that online coaching provides. Like, I provide online coaching. However, depending on the client, you've got to make that decision for yourself too, as whether maybe an in-person deal is better for you, or maybe you need to put more effort into getting out to in-person events where you can learn some hands-on practical experience. But I could probably say to most of my clients, if I got them for, a week of training, we'd achieve a massive amount of progress depending on how they apply themselves. So there's a few nuances there, but you get the gist of what I'm saying. Now, one sort of cool event that's happening in a couple of weeks is JPS Health and Fitness down in Melbourne are putting on their annual physique conference, which I went to last year, and that was awesome. I'm going back again this year. And look, I've had this discussion with guys like Dr. Martin Ruffalo, who he's one of the head guys at JPS. You have to excuse me in not putting forth his proper title, but it's really come down in terms of attendance to these in-person events, and I'd like to see if I can make an impact on that front. Maybe not this year, most likely next. But you can really get a lot, and never thinking that you know it all, always being a student of the game is something you should take into any aspect of life, but particularly bodybuilding, because there's always a different way. There's many different ways to skin a cat. Of course, there's always our foundational elements like training intensity, for example, but There's little things you can learn that will go a long way in terms of your progress. And sometimes it's just a matter of being refreshed on a certain topic or being introduced to new ideas. I remember last year at the physique conference, Richard Collins, who has some really awesome practical takeaways coaching for coaching success, right? Or trying to develop the athlete into a more intrinsically motivated athlete, I think is a good way of putting it, right? So making sure that the motivations are in the right place, but then also making sure that the wins or, the day-to-day positives are taken away from more process-orientated things to tick off. Things like, how was my training session? Was the quality where it needed to be? Not, am I looking good in the mirror today? Another example is, did I consume, adequate fruit, vegetable, protein intake for the day? And were my calories in check to whatever system I'm following? If you focus more on that rather than the scale weight, or like I said, am I looking good in the mirror? You're far more better off in terms of where that motivation lies, whether it's intrinsic or extrinsic. And it's really important to distinguish those. But the way in which Richard Collins put it to the conference was, think about, a success statement. So something along the lines of, I performed, or I focused on the process like an elite athlete, and then define that, and then have the client or the athlete answer yes, which is going to be indicative of the definition you gave. There's going to be then a kind of option where it's going to be a midway between yes and no, and then there's a straight up no, to where they were just really off the mark for that given day. And if you incorporate that into a daily check-in, to where they submit their weight, their steps, and any other information that you see fit to collect on a daily basis, and then you incorporate that into the daily check-in, that can have really powerful impact on bringing these things up that are actually challenging for the athlete or the client. So that was one thing that I took away that was huge. And then Eric Helms was actually there that year. He did a cool presentation on thinking about movements and joints a little bit differently, with regards to, okay, what happens if I do a bicep curl in front of my body to behind my body? Does it make much of a difference? Well, yeah, it does for certain muscles that flex the elbow, but generally it's going to be a similar thing. And just looking in more depth to the anatomy of some of our muscles. And then we had Dr. Martin Raffaello do a post-competition phase presentation, which was awesome. And really the main thing that I took away there was a more in-depth understanding of the recovery diet, rather than looking to reverse. So a very slow incremental increase in, we could just say generally, total calories. It's a different approach to where we have a more rapid increase at the start. Yes, it's still controlled and manageable, but the goal is to get someone back to a recovered state. And for one given person, that could be 5 kilos above stage weight. For another, it could be 10 to 15. It's very different person to person. You need to have the right questions that are prompted. Things like, what are food cravings like? How's food focus? How do you feel your libido is? You're still waking up really early in the morning. Has sleep quality improved? Things like that can help dictate and determine how far or close you are to, being recovered post-competition, and that is not the same for everyone. So look, all in all, in-person learning, super underrated. If you ever had posing coaching and you've had both an experience online and in person, you're probably able to reflect on that and say, yeah, I got a lot more I got a reasonable amount more out of my in-person session, but then again, you can still get a lot out of online learning. However, if you're really wanting to help push the community, I think the in-person stuff is awesome to get around and get amongst. Now, Moving on to another topic. Let's talk about sleep. Probably one of the most underrated components of a natural bodybuilder's sphere, right? And how ensuring you're looking at the right things when you're trying to determine whether sleep is where it needs to be is really important. So, what are some of those things that you need to be looking out for? Well, one, total caffeine intake, frequency, and then also when was the last time you consumed caffeine in the day? For some people, caffeine can have a half-life of 8 hours. Generally, it's going to be somewhere between 4 to 6, but you could be one of those people that metabolizes caffeine quite slow. Then again, you could also be someone that metabolizes it quite fast. However, it's important to recognize that the half-life refers to the amount of time it takes to come down to half of its initial quantity. If it was 100 milligrams of caffeine, it might take someone 6 hours to then only experience or only still have 50 milligrams of caffeine in the system. But the thing is, if you then have a second dose of caffeine, say 3 hours later, of another 100 milligrams, you are now at 150 milligrams. And then after another 6 hours, that 100 turns into 50 and that 50 turns into 75. And then you're at 75 milligrams of caffeine. And the research suggests there was more recent meta-analysis into caffeine intakes. And that positions, an approximate amount of 50 milligrams still in the system seems to be okay in terms of the things they were able to measure with sleep. Once you start to head above that, that's when you start to get worse and worse sleep-related outcomes. And it's not linear. Well, it would probably be a U-shaped curve, but it slowly gets more and more, and then it has probably a more aggressive impact. It's very rarely these things linear forever, but you get what I mean. It's probably going to get worse the more you take and the closer you take that to bed. I generally put forth, try, especially in a contest prep, try not to consume caffeine 8 hours within going to bed. So if you're going to bed at 8 o'clock, for example, cutting it off at about 12 is probably a good idea. Then what other things can we talk about with sleep? Well, let's talk about other aspects of sleep hygiene. Making sure you got a dark room, making sure that it's cool and it's not really hot in there, because that's not going to be a great idea to try and encourage your body temperature to drop, which is required to experience sleep onset. Having a reduction in bright lights before you go to bed and having a good wind down window is super important. I noticed that massively. If I go to bed at about 8:30 and I stop work at about 6:45, I'm going to have a much better sleep. If I stop work at 7:30, my brain just doesn't get enough time to settle down before I put my head on the pillow. In terms of other aspects, if you're consuming a large amount of calories, I'd be aware of having a big meal really close to bed. That's just going to maybe not make you feel comfortable when you're lying down. And also, it could lean into making you a little bit hotter because your body is in the process of digesting, or the more immediate processes of digesting food. So there's that to consider. In terms of other aspects, do you use, red light or blue light blocking glasses? It's like, maybe. In terms of, does it do anything as far as we know in the science community? Probably not. Does it look like it's a negative? No. If you can rationalize the cost, then I'd say go for it. It's not a huge amount. It's a one-time off fee of, approximately $200, making sure you're getting a good quality pair, that it's not merely a tint, that it is actually cutting out the blue wavelength of light. And you can simply test that by looking at a blue object. It should pretty much look black. But you'd want to know that before you buy it. Let's put it like that. I also used to listen to a Spotify, not a podcast, but a gentleman, Steven. I would listen to him going to bed throughout every night of contest prep without missing, without fail, because that just helped me get into my rhythm, my groove of going to bed. When I heard that sound, I knew it was time to shut down the brain and just go to sleep. I also find that cutting off most of my water intake before 3 hours before going to bed, sometimes a little bit more, makes a big difference in terms of if I'm going up to the bathroom more than once. Sometimes I don't need to go at all. I can just sleep straight through. That's been a little bit rare of late, but we're getting closer, making some improvements, which is good. And that's really the big chunk. Just like the blue light blocking glasses, you can look at supplementation, but these things are going to have a much bigger impact on your quality and total duration of sleep. And then, of course, the other one, really the no shit Sherlock option, is making sure you got enough time to sleep. If you give yourself 8 hours, you're probably going to get at most 7 hours and 45 minutes. If you give yourself 9 hours, well, you might be able to get 8.5 hours of sleep in. Maybe 15 minutes to get to bed, and you maybe need to go up to the bathroom once. And that probably is going to relate to 8.5 hours or maybe a little bit more. But if you're not prioritizing it, you're not going to give yourself a good opportunity to get good sleep. And in terms of a natural athlete and what we have in our controllables, we've got training, and if we're ticking that off, awesome. Got nutrition, and if we're ticking that off, we're double awesome. But then you've also got your recovery modalities. So making sure that if training, nutrition are where they need to be, sleep is really the main one in terms of recovery. And if you're not prioritizing that and you're a natural athlete, I think there's a lot of gains being left on the table. Yes, one night of bad sleep isn't going to make a massive difference, but if you get an accumulation of poor sleep, growth in the off season, I would be very surprised if it's as good. To whether it is a bigger impact on ability to build muscle compared to ability to train well, I think it's probably more leaning into your ability to train really well, intensely, making sure that you're psychologically focused and switched on, and going back to that intensity point, that you're able to give 100% effort every session. If you're really tired and you're just absolutely in the gutter because your sleep is so poor, or maybe you've normalized to it, you're not going to be able to perform as well, which will have downstream effects on the amount of muscle you're able to grow or stimulate to grow. So it's less about, okay, yeah, you're still able to grow muscle even if you're in a sleep deficit, which I'm unsure of whether that has been 100% reflected in the literature, but from what I've seen on some clips, it might be the case. But if you're not able to maximally stimulate an adaptation in the gym, being hypertrophy, well, then you're just not going to maximally accrue muscle tissue. So do not sleep on sleep. Haha. Now, this week was just going to be a bit of a shorter one, bit of a diary log, but all in all, very happy. I did a little pose down with Brandon last week, and that was an awesome point of comparison for me. I was able to see the level I expect and want to be at, and I was able to compare myself to that. Am I there yet? No. Am I far off? Maybe. If you ask me, I'd say, yeah, there's a bit of time there. If you ask BK, he'd probably say it's not too long. But the one thing that will not change is the drive and the motivation to be in a position to be in a position where I am giving myself absolutely everything to achieve that. And all in all, what was the difference? What was the comparison? It was literally muscle everywhere. I was thinking to myself, maybe I'm going to grab him here on the side leg. No chance. Yeah. It was close on the side leg, probably the closest thing I had on him. But it was just density more muscle everywhere. So that is the goal. Bit more priority to my biceps, and we're pretty much good to go. So without further ado, thank you guys for listening. We'll have a episode next week with Brandon and Rachel. I believe Rachel will be tagging along, which is awesome. And then we'll be getting on one of the OGs in bodybuilding in Australia, someone that I actually mentioned earlier in the episode, which will be an awesome conversation. And it'll be cool if you haven't heard of him to expose you to him, because he's had a massive impact on the community here and deserves recognition for the things that he's done. So without further ado, guys, have an awesome rest of your week, being Tuesday. I hope Monday was great to you. And let me know if you've got any feedback. Chat soon, guys.